in the book of Proverbs, chapter 13. A wise child loves discipline, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. From the fruit of their words, good persons eat good things, but the desire of the treacherous is for wrongdoing. Those who guard their mouths preserve their lives. Those who open wide their lips come to ruin. The appetite of the lazy craves and gets nothing, while the appetite of the diligent is richly supplied. The righteous hate falsehood, but the wicked act shamefully and disgracefully. Righteousness guards one whose way is upright, but sin overthrows the wicked. Some pretend to be rich, yet have nothing. Others pretend to be poor, yet have great wealth. Wealth is a ransom for a person's life, but the poor get no threats. Those who despise the word bring destruction on themselves, but those who respect the commandment will be rewarded. The teaching of the wise is a fountain of life, so that one may avoid the snares of death. Good sense wins favor, but the way of the faithless is their ruin. The clever do all things intelligently, but the fool displays folly. A bad messenger brings trouble, but a faithful envoy, healing. Poverty and disgrace are for the one who ignores the instruction, but one who heeds reproof is honored.
This is Matt. If you've not met Matt, you should. He's also the husband of Teresa, who is leading. Just give a little bit of context here. If you've not been with us for a while, maybe ever before in this series, we started this series way back in September called Your Mental Game, Back to the Basics. And what we said from the very beginning was we have high regard for the professionals, the experts, the science of it all. And what we were trying to do in this series is say, so where's the low-hanging fruit? Where's the wisdom of ages past? Just as a way of contrasting what it is that we're doing. What are the things that people used to do that maybe we're looking past and neglecting? And we started this whole conversation, some of you may remember, by looking at Romans 12, where Paul says these incredible words of be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And the thing I love about that text is it speaks to me, I think it makes it clear that faith and science are not at odds with one another, that they play on the same team, and in a sense that like God designed our brains, because here's Paul saying something that by modern parlance is very scientific. So we wanted to take this weekend and do a panel, work with a couple different therapists and experts in the field, but one of them got sick last night. So then there were two.
That was a bummer.
It was a bummer. Shannon Stevens, some of you know her. She's a great therapist in town and would have contributed a lot of value as well. But also, thanks for being willing. I texted him yesterday like, okay, Matt, Shannon's gone. Are you okay? Because it's going to be a crappy sermon if I got to put this together. Starting
no
noon
pressure,
on Saturday.
No pressure.
Yeah, exactly. We'd have just had Teresa sing more, I think, which would have also translated to work for you. So,
right.
So thank you for being here.
Yeah, no problem.
You want to just give us a little context, like just a couple minutes of Matt's life up until this point? Where do you come from? Who are you? What have you done? I didn't tell you I was going to ask that.
That's a big question. I'll just try to sum that up a little bit.
Because you're pretty new to our community.
Yes, new to Helena, sort of. I did spend a couple years here growing up. My parents have lived here for years, but grew up in Valier, north of here. That's kind of where my prominent years were spent, and then moved away. Have spent roughly 20, I was thinking about that before we started the service here. You had asked, like, how long have I been doing this? And roughly, in some capacity in and around mental health and psychology, 28 years. So pretty much my entire career.
That's remarkable.
So, and then obviously recently got married to an amazing woman. So
yeah. We're really glad that she kept you here, not you pulled her there. That would have been bad. So could you just, like, from just the ground level, when you hear Romans 12:1 and this idea of neuroplasticity, what is neuroplasticity? How would you have us understand that?
Well, to simplify neuroplasticity, it honestly is just learning. It's the ability to put yourself in a context or in a scenario that you're unfamiliar with, uncomfortable with, and be able to make connections and learn and grow within that, which expands. It can be as simple, just to simplify it, like taking a dance lesson. I'm not really good with that, but I'm getting better with that, right? Because I'm purposefully doing something to kind of understand that and make those connections.
So how much of your work are you dealing with people who are convinced that, because I guess that the term plasticity isn't to imply like ever-changing or ever-moldable?
Yes, yeah.
So how much in your work are you having to take on just that very issue of like, no, you can change?
A lot. In fact, primarily, that's a big function within therapy, is helping people understand they can change, that there is possibilities.
So what do you say to the person who sits down and goes like, dude, I'm 43, I've always had anxiety, I will always have anxiety. Mm-hmm. What does neuroplasticity say to that?
Neuroplasticity says, hey, we can sit with that concept and look at that and try to understand why they feel that that's just the way it's going to be, but then begin to introduce other concepts and ideas that hopefully then expand their understanding of that, which then reintroduce choice back to them.
So a text that says you can change, and a therapist who says you can change.
Correct.
So within the neuroplasticity field, and just this, if we maybe even simplify it and go after this, like in this idea that you can change, that what I hear you saying is who you are is not who you have to be. Those are my words. But what's the low-hanging fruit?
You know, the low-hanging fruit in that obviously is something that you guys have been discussing for several weeks now, which is self-care, nutrition, sleep, exercise, all of those things. Community is another big part of that, because some of the things that build neuroplasticity, or the ability to kind of learn and grow in that, is things like mindfulness and hobbies, things you might find that you're passionate about, connecting with some sort of community and other people. Obviously, you could do those little brain games and things like that, and those do help, the way our brain functions. But, so self-care and connecting with community are some of the base level low-hanging fruit to.
So to what extent, if any, do you see a correlation between things like hobbies and other interests and mental health?
That's a big part of it. I think it's a very, very important, because it becomes a support structure for anybody struggling with mental health, because it creates what we call mindfulness. This ability to put your brain in the present, where you're not worried about what's happened in the past, you're not anxious about what's going to happen in the future. And so essentially, it's this concept that emotions only exist in the past or the future, not in the present. And so if we do things like a hobby, or, I love to tie flies and go fly fishing, but one reason I love that stuff is because it's mindfulness for me, right? It puts me in the present, and I don't think about anything else.
Wow. And you're saying that's not avoidance, that's healthy.
Correct.
Huh. Okay. So speaking of avoidance, we've talked a little bit about, and I know that this is a passion area for you, as I understand it, is what is the role of pain avoidance in a person's changing and getting well?
Well, we were kind of talking about that the other day, the pain aversion. When we are at a place where we are only going to avoid the pain that's happening, then we find ourselves not changing and not feeling any different. We have to get to that place where we become comfortable. It's not enjoyable, but understanding that we will be okay if we are uncomfortable.
Because at one time, I didn't ask permission to bring this up, but one time I said, how many sessions do you need with somebody to know whether or not you can help them? Do you remember what you said?
I said one.
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because you can usually tell how quickly somebody's willing to be uncomfortable. Now, I want to do an add-on to that.
Sure.
Which is if somebody comes in and they're not comfortable, they don't want to face those things. One, they don't usually show up in my office yet. Sometimes they do.
So that itself is a sign of them willing to get comfortable.
And sometimes they do. And even then, if they're just not quite ready to, it doesn't mean we can't get them ready to face that. It just means we have to do some pre-work to kind of become more comfortable just with whatever trauma or pain is happening.
So it's maybe not as black and white as I portrayed it, but yet still an important thing.
Very important.
The reason I have this in my hand is Justin did put together a Q&A thing on Slido, so there's an irony. I know we're asking you to look at your phones, but if we'll use the last 10 minutes or so to ask some questions, so if there are questions that you want me to ask Matt, if they're good enough, I'll ask them. If not, we'll just skip them. Just kidding. But we can't ask them all, but we'll try.
I like Crest toothpaste. No, so if anybody wanted to ask that.
So yeah, if you want to ask some questions there, and that's why I'm holding this big dumb iPad. And now I just completely lost my train of thought. So what is because you're a person of faith.
Yes. And
a person who respects the science of therapy, neuroplasticity. Yes. Where do you see, how do you nuance when your faith is helpful to you and when the science of therapy is helpful for you?
I think they're both equally helpful at all times, honestly.
Okay.
Having that understanding, we're complex beings, we're holistic beings, there's many facets to who we are. And so at times, looking at the science of the brain and the amygdala and the temporal lobes and all that stuff and how our brains function is important so we understand our biological self. But our faith is important to integrate into that so we understand our spiritual self and then how those two things connect together and support each other.
Because I was at some meetings last week where somebody said, we don't need all this therapy. It's all ultimately a God problem. How would you respond to that?
Pretty much like that. I think that's a very, very shallow perspective. Because God, I don't know.
By the way, he didn't have any of these questions beforehand.
No,
so
but I don't know if I can answer that without really stepping on some toes or taking much more time than Adam wants me to take up here. So,
can you do it in 3 minutes?
I'll try.
Because you were talking even the other day about the difference between pastoral care and clinical therapy.
Yes, and absolutely. When we have, some people do have that perspective that mental health is in some way or shape a lack of spiritual health, okay, which I don't agree with. And the two do need, again, we're a holistic being. Those are just two separate parts of who we are that need addressed. There is a necessary component to pastoral counseling as well as clinical counseling. They serve two separate roles. They support a person in two distinctly separate ways, but both can be very valuable and necessary in that. Because, we just going kind of back to the science of it, if we try to ignore the science of it, then are we really, able to find that complete ability to process through or to heal or to grow through that issue?
And what I picked up the other day was you have this really, within your practice, you have this really strong passion about education.
Yeah.
And could you say a little more to that of just what you were referencing?
Yeah,
there?
And it was kind of a good conversation we were having with Shannon the other day, kind of preparing for this. And so unfortunately she can't be here today because she had a lot of good stuff to put in on those topics. But psychoeducation is kind of what we call that, and it's such a valuable tool because it leans towards the neuroplasticity and the pain aversion and things like that, and just the value of therapy and the value of our faith. But to understand, how do our brains work? Why do we feel the way we feel? Why do we say what we say? And going back to that question of blending that with our faith, the reality is God created us. I mean, God created the science that's inside of me. And so, there's a good combination of the two there. But yeah, psychoeducation is very, very important. And I think a lot of therapists understand that and really utilize that as a big part of going to counseling. It's just helping people understand who are you and why do you do what you do.
So generally speaking, when someone sits down and you kind of go man, this person just needs some kind of 101 education on where does that generally start for you? What tends to be the knowledge that people lack?
A lot of just the basic stuff, but a lot of it's that blending of the mental health with the body's biology, looking at how the brain functions and why it does. If we look at anger management or things like that.
Use that as an example.
We get in there and so we begin to kind of break it down and just without judgment of right or wrong, but to understand okay, what is the source of anger? Where does anger come from? And just kind of helping them understand the basic foundation of that and then helping them to apply that into their specific scenarios. And suddenly it starts to make more sense to them.
And am I thinking about this correctly, that part of the way the neuroplasticity comes in is, take anger for an example.
Right.
I can't remember if it was you or Shannon that was using that phrase, the superhighway.
Yeah, Shannon was. Yeah.
But I think you had started that conversation just about how the reason you got from here to here so quickly is that your brain had a path for that.
Yeah, exactly. Our minds are mysterious and wonderful things, but they're also very effective. So if they do something over and over a few different times and there's a pattern there, they'll just pick it up, and as soon as you hit A, it'll just go to Z. Because it's already formed those pathways and those connections in the brain. It knows where it's going to go.
So is that why, because you were saying earlier that generally speaking, for every year that somebody has a dysfunctional pattern, it takes a month of therapy?
Yeah, it's not a in-stone number, but
Right.
it's they have studied that some, and it generally takes, roughly about a month of counseling to kind of undo a year's worth of dysfunction. But again, that's because we're having to address all those neural pathways, all those habits and patterns of of behaviors and emotional functioning. And so it just takes time to, one, create awareness of what's going on, and then to reintroduce choice and control, and then the practice of kind of working with somebody to help them just kind of, tear down the old stuff and rebuild the new stuff, essentially.
Yeah, and what gives me pause when you're saying that is, having now worked in church for 20 years, like, one of the things that makes me the most sad, but I've also felt it personally, is when I see in somebody that they didn't lose hope in their faith, they lost hope in themselves.
Correct.
And that one way of preserving this faith that they respect is to disqualify themselves for fear of being that person. And yet what I hear you saying is, like, yeah, that's the process of therapy, is that just because you believe the right thing doesn't mean that all that hard work that has to happen to break those habits has been done.
Correct.
So
Correct.
that's one of those things that makes me really grateful to be living out my faith in 2022, is the complement of those two things, that they're not at odds with one another.
Mm-hmm.
So how does a person, like, how do I know, like, okay, I've got something and there's low-hanging fruit and I need to deal with this versus I need to go see a therapist? Like, how would you advise a person to ascertain, is it time for me to call Matt?
Sure.
Or is it time for me to call my friends and have a conversation?
Sure, I think that's a real simple answer, actually, because if a person is to the point where whatever is troubling them, whether it be a trauma or mental health thing or anything in that scope of things, if it gets to the point where you're starting to impact your daily functioning, if you're starting to be more isolated, if you're starting to avoid things instead of approach things, that's really, to me, where it kind of begins to transition to, you might really be able to benefit from the support of another person that has, kind of a neutral perspective on what's happening in your life and might be able to speak into that. Because we have this, there's a distinct difference between what I consider clinical issues, like clinical depression, clinical anxiety, and situational anxiety and situational depression. And many times those are the ones that, like you said, people can do kind of some really good self-care. They can maybe, if they have a good support structure and, again, some sort of community, whether that be family or friends that they can talk to. And many times they can kind of work themselves and walk themselves through that process. But yes, if it does come to that point of starting to really disrupt the way they function each day, then that's usually, to me, the time to reach out for some extra help.
So did I hear you that, like, part of it is relative to the strength of your community? Like that a person who, because you talked about, sorry, I was trying to multitask there.
Fine.
But I've been fascinated for a while. Like Larry Crabb wrote this book. I don't know if you're familiar with Larry Crabb, but he's this Christian psychologist, wrote this book called Connecting in the early 2000s, late 90s. And he got himself in a lot of trouble because his baseline argument was, if people, and especially Christians, did a better job with community, there would be a lot less need for people like me.
I completely agree. Community is huge, right? Like, if you think about, just the history of mankind, like we're designed around community. The way God created us is for relationship. And so there's something innate inside of all of us that does better when we have some sort of community and some sort of connection outside of ourselves to other people, other things, other experiences.
So you've been in this field pre-iPhone.
Yeah.
I was actually watching a Jim Gaffigan show the other day, and he's like, are you old, or are you like graduated high school and didn't have a cell phone old? So, yeah, same here. So, can you speak to, like, the extent to which you see a difference pre-iPhone versus post?
Well, that's a deep dive there, but
yeah, we're going to talk about technology next week.
Yeah, technology has had, I think, both a positive and negative impact on our ability to function with healthy mental health. There can, and this is where sometimes, I'm probably not every parent's fan, because I sometimes try to explain to parents, whether it be an iPhone or a gaming system or things like that, like, to some extent that creates mindfulness, okay? And so it can be healthy, but at the same point in time, again, if it's overused and becomes just a tool of avoidance, then it becomes unhealthy. And that, so whether we're on our phone or on a gaming system or binging a Netflix series or something, like, to a point, that can be really healthy for us because it can put us in the present. We can shut our brains down for a little bit, emotionally de-escalate, just kind of take that deep sigh. which means that we're going to think more clearly, we're going to have more logic and more reason happening in our thought process. But yeah, there's a fine balance in there, absolutely.
Yeah, it's helpful. Okay, so there's a few questions here. Are there any tools that you recommend people put in their toolbox to train their brain outside of diet and exercise? I think you've spoke to a couple of those. But.
Learning a hobby. Find something new you don't know about, you've never done before, and take a class or do something like that is a big one.
Why? What does that accomplish?
It just helps create the neural pathways in the brain for learning and growth. And, it's this concept of learning to approach yourself and approach life with curiosity. And so when we lose our curiosity about life and about ourselves, our brain pretty much kind of stops functioning outside of what it's currently at.
Interesting. Wow. Do you consider it a problem if someone has a habit of not talking about their emotions? I think my wife wrote that one. Just kidding.
No, honestly, to me, it's not a problem. It's normal. I mean, the reality is I think all of us at some point in time have struggled with that. It honestly takes learning that we can talk about those and be uncomfortable talking about those and be okay before we really kind of start to do that more openly. So that's pretty normal.
It's normal, but is it a problem?
Well, I could go several different directions.
Yeah.
It's not a problem if that person is talking to somebody.
So I don't have to talk. I don't think she wrote it, but so there's no delineated path like you have to talk to your parents or you have to talk to your spouse, but you've got to have an outlet for that.
Correct. Yeah,
that's helpful.
We can spend too much time inside of our own heads.
Yeah. Is that why writing, which I'm guessing is a lost art?
Yep.
Because it's just, even though it's still inside of you, it's leaving you.
Yes.
It's personal, but it's leaving you.
Yeah, you're allowing that, whatever you're writing, even though you're not speaking it, you're writing, but you're still allowing that to be present. And that's kind of the magic Pixie dust with that.
Wow. Please speak to the role of adversity in mental health.
I guess adversity.
I don't know. They might have to pay you $100 to get an answer to their question. They can come see you. I don't know what they mean. Please speak to the role of adversity.
Like adversity within a session, adversity within the person, adversity to counseling.
I'm guessing adversity in life would be my guess. Like what role does adversity have? Because you even talked about, maybe we'll just take this path, and if we're wrong, you can grab Matt afterwards. But one of the things I've noted from you and from Shannon and from Travis is this but we have to nuance trauma. It's a different conversation when there's major trauma. Why is that such a different conversation?
Well, it just impacts our neurobiology different, and it impacts our mental health differently. But as far as going back maybe to bring back around to that concept of adversity in counseling is we need adversity. We have to have adversity to grow. I mean, the reality is as a human, when we look at the biology of the brain, there's very little that we learn that doesn't come through adversity in life, whether that be late night studying and stressing over how am I going to pass that college exam or,
Interesting.
Whether I've just lost a loved one or, there's so many things in life. And most of those, I think, as people look back historically at their schema, right, that there's their whole life experience, that almost everything that they have learned that they feel good about has come through some form of adversity.
Wow. It just reminded me, I was listening yesterday to this Anglican bishop, and he made the comment, in speaking about spiritual practices, he made the comment that there's certain things that we won't learn about Christ and certain strengths that we will never have outside of suffering. And he said, we've got this huge list of spiritual practices. And he said, but there's certain things that'll never be true of you outside of suffering. It's terrifying. But
it's not fun.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any books or resources that you've been recommending lately to people struggling with anxiety and coping?
A lot of that depends on the kind of what type of anxiety they're dealing with. That's a pretty broad question.
Yeah.
Some of the ones I recommend to people have to do with, different attachment styles, which have a lot to play into different anxieties. There's one out there by Sandra Wilson called Release from Shame. That's a big one I refer people to just because the concept of shame has so much to do with how we experience anxiety and why we experience anxiety and stuff. So, I don't typically, I wouldn't say I have a good referral for just anxiety, but I try to look more at like what are those roots of anxieties and try to direct people more that direction.
So people, people plop down in your chair for the first session, or they lay on a couch. Just kidding.
I'd get my pipe out.
Yeah, exactly. There's all these directions my brain wants to go right now. Stop. What tends to be, like to the extent that there's a theme, what tends to be the majority reason why someone's there?
I don't feel good as a human.
Whoa.
For whatever capacity. I mean, it comes down to shame.
Huh.
I mean, I'd say 95% of what I work with has a root in some sort of shame.
Wow.
Not feeling good about ourselves. Feeling less than not good enough.
Huh. Wow. I guess that's why Brene Brown has such a good business going.
Mm-hmm.
Is it only bad if you have negative emotions and don't talk about them, or is it equally bad if you generally feel good but don't talk about it? Someone really wants someone talking here.
I know, right? Yeah, exactly.
I'm just kidding.
No, I think here's the reality is to not talk about those things can be okay if we're being purposeful about processing through that within ourselves and maybe, with maybe one other person or something. It's not like we have to talk to everybody about that. There is, obviously some concern if a person is feeling a lot of large emotion that's negative and they're kind of being avoidant of it.
Mm-hmm.
Can that person still function and get through life? Okay, potentially, yeah. Are they going to feel really great about that? Probably not. So no, there's strong value in talking about how we're feeling. But it's also something that we as a society have been taught not to do. And that it creates weakness, and that, so if somebody's dealing with the concept of feeling less than and not good enough already, low self-worth, low self-value, and they've been taught that emotions and feelings like that are weakness, they're not going to want to talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And so instead of addressing that specifically head on, you want to begin to address more like, hey, why are the beliefs that you have, where'd they come from? Why do you believe what you do believe?
So how do you nuance, like, okay, I'm looking at a 17-year-old, like, of course you don't know this yet, you're 17, this is part of life of growing up, like thinking of even Paul of like putting on your salvation, and you're 54, and you should know this by now, so we're behind. Like, does that matter in therapy?
No.
It doesn't.
No.
Why?
Why? Because we can only do and be responsible for what we know.
Okay.
And if nobody in our life has ever taught us those things, then really we have no responsibility as far as judging ourselves of whether we're good or not good because we know that or don't know that, because if we've not been taught that and we don't know it, then we can't be responsible for it.
Okay, last question.
Yep.
If you could wave a wand over all of us, or maybe more appropriately, pray a prayer over all of us, and there was all one thing that we all did, what would it be? It's a big spot I just put you on.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about like 10 different things. So I'm trying to think of one. Work on allowing what you feel to be present.
What does that mean, present?
Well, allowing yourself to feel it, to talk about it, to write about it.
Okay.
To just let yourself feel it in whatever capacity that is. So
the ability to be articulate and intelligent about what it is that you're feeling in this moment.
Yeah, not avoiding it, but just letting it be present in whatever capacity that needs to happen.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
God, thanks for this time with Matt, and thanks for the different ways that you've resourced him and molded and changed him. Thanks for people like him in our community who love people and love you, and I want to see us get healthier. God, I pray for people in this room who we're all listening to this from different angles, and maybe even for some there was this desire for something different this morning, but that even in that discomfort, that you'd help us see what is it that you have for us this morning, and what is it that you'd have for us to take for the good of others back into life. Jesus, we love you. Amen.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook or Instagram.